Club Kid movement of the late 80s and 90s brought about the best kind of insanity that boosted prominent members of the LGBT community to celebrity status. This includes household names like Lady Bunny, RuPaul, and Amanda Lepore. After the death of Warhol, a creative void needed to be filled. A subculture of misfits, fueled by drugs and dreams of their own 15 minutes, filled this void, and the Club Kid scene of New York City was born. I became interested in this subculture while reading about the vibrant life of Club Kid Walt Cassidy. Researching the subculture has made me understand the complexity and beauty of the club scene and how it evolved into a place of self-expression that helped pave the way for many young creatives. In order to show you that there was much more than meets the eye when it comes to Club Kids of New York City, I will explain how they began, the haunting timeline of drugs that fueled the parties, as well as the cultural impact they had and continue to have. First, we will discuss how Club Kids formed and the cultural disruption they caused. Stonewall riots in 1969 changed self-perceptions within the subculture from feeling guilty to being apologetic to feelings of self-acceptance and pride. Following this, in the 1970s, ball houses, groups in the drag community that serve as a non-biological family, and for many members, this was their only family, had started to become more diverse. And by the mid-80s, all personalities from different venues were melding together through shared events. This was the turning point that made balls a safe haven for LGBT people of color. It was the mid-80s when the Club Kids began to take shape. It was an era that was created amidst fears of nuclear war, conservative politics, and the AIDS epidemic. Tensions were high in the US, and this beautifully distorted underground scene was a direct reflection of that. Warhol filmed the performances at underground nightclubs and broadcasted them on MTV through his project 15 Minutes. Young creatives like Michael Alig and many others flocked to New York City to achieve their own 15 minutes of fame and to find refuge in the houses on the scene. There were said to be 750 Club Kids in the core underground scene at its height. Walt Cassidy, an original Club Kid, likens himself and his peers to 2020 social media influencers and explained that Club Kids presented their personalities and their lifestyles as products. By the 90s, the parties seemed to be never ending and the drugs began to escalate. Cassidy recalls in an interview with New York Post the devastating timeline of drug use that eventually would lead to the end of the original Club Kids era. Drugs were both the catalyst for long nights that turned to early mornings and the downfall of the scene, he says. What started with pot, acid, and ecstasy eventually divulged into Special K and eventually heroin, which ruined everything. Eventually, many that were on the scene using drugs began freebasing and smoking crack as well. Cassidy reflected, that's when it all got really dirty and really dark and fell apart, he says. Michael Alig, who I mentioned earlier, his behavior became erratic and specifically began to get worse as the drugs progressed. At the time, the justification was, there are 50 people watching, and this is a show. And I thought, if they're not going to stop me, it must be okay, he says. But in March 1996, Michael Alig and Robert Riggs, high on heroin, murdered Andre Angel Melendez over a drug debt. On December 7, 1996, the New York Times published an article in the newspaper summarizing the events that took place the night of the murder. It was like an alarm went off and suddenly the underground movement that made so many feel safe was tainted. Walt Cassidy felt as if his experience of being young creatives against the thrilling backdrop of New York City had been hijacked during one of its most fruitful decades. Cassidy decided that this was not his story, and he released New York Club Kids to describe his own experience and change the narrative. The drugs and murder were only one part of New York's Club Kid movement, but there were also a parallel narrative to his dark side of the club scene. It was one that embodied self-acceptance and innovation. A melding together of different cultures, art, and music inspired a generation of young creatives that continues to have an impact on pop culture. Walt Cassidy explains the stark differences between the party scene during the 80s and the 70s. The Club Kid movement was against the grain of the pre-existing scene of the 70s, which was seen as too pristine This made it possible for the rise of standout personalities like RuPaul, Debbie Harry, Lady Bunny, and Amanda Lepore, who would continue to impact young artists today. This movement was a pivotal point to overcoming racial divides in the LGBT community. It also is a key source of inspiration for artists today. Without this subculture, not only would we not have celebrities like RuPaul, Bjork, and Amanda Lepore, who were directly part of the subculture, but we'd also not have artists who came up in many of the same venues after the end of the movement and were inspired by it, like Lady Gaga. The Club Kid movement of New York City was a storm of innovation that brought together a variety of cultures and perspectives that got tainted by the brutal murder of Angel Melendez. It is essential that we not allow the negative aspects of the Club Kid subculture to overshadow the many positive things that came from it as a whole. And here are some of the images from the Club Kid. The Club Kids had to rely on photographers to get their pictures because social media was not prevalent at the time. So they had to get on talk shows and do interviews in order to get recognition. And that is all. Thank you.